Even on a blustery autumn day, Chichester Harbour, near Portsmouth on the south coast of England, is a picturesque spot. Tourists and yachting people flock here in the summer. Landlubbers can take a trip round the bay. It is not the kind of place where fishermen expect too many surprises. But it was at Chichester, in the mid-1950s, that local men fished from the water not one, but two grisly corpses, both of them headless, handless, and clad in the remains of a frogman's suit. The corpses were clues in a mystery which began on the 18th of April 1956, when the Russian cruiser, or Johnny Kidsey, arrived in Portsmouth Harbour. She was rumoured to be a very special ship, with a revolutionary steering gear, and she carried two very special passengers. Making a goodwill visit to Britain were the Soviet Premier, Nikita Khrushchev, and his deputy, Nikolai Bulganin. For the British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, the visit was a remarkable diplomatic coup. All was smiles when he met the Russian leaders at London's Victoria Station. But soon the Russians' goodwill would be stretched to the limit. Their visit came at the height of the Cold War, but there were signs that a thaw might be on the way. In Moscow, only a month before, at a closed session of the Communist Party Congress, Khrushchev had denounced Joseph Stalin as a criminal murderer. The ebullient Khrushchev and the beaming, goateed Bulganin embarked on a tour of Britain. The unpredictable Khrushchev ruffled a few feathers when he said that if he lived in Britain, he would vote for the Conservatives rather than the Socialist Labour Party. But all seemed to be going well. But even as B and K, as they were dubbed, met the children on a Royal Air Force base, a first-class international incident was brewing. At one of the official dinners, a Soviet diplomat asked the British First Lord of the Admiralty, Jamie Thomas, what a frogman had been doing swimming off the bows of the Johnny Kidsey. The frogman was the 45-year-old wartime hero, Commander Lionel Crabb. Crabb was never seen again. His mission and the fate which overtook him remain a mystery to this day. Within 2 weeks, the story broke. The official line was that Crabb had died in the Portsmouth area, nowhere near the Russian cruiser, testing top-secret equipment. This did not satisfy the Russians. They issued a diplomatic note stating that a frogman had been seen off the Johnny Kidsey. The incident was an acute embarrassment to Anthony Eden. He had given the British intelligence service explicit orders that there was to be no spying on the Russians during their visit. In the House of Commons, he faced a barrage of hostile questions from the Labour opposition. Eden stonewalled. He finally admitted that what had happened, whatever it was, had been done without his knowledge. Furthermore, he claimed that it would not be in the public interest to disclose the circumstances in which Commander Crabb was presumed to have met his death. But the file on Commander Crabb has stubbornly refused to remain closed. Over a year after the Johnny Kidsey incident, On the morning of the 9th of June 1957, a corpse with no hands or head and clad in a black rubber diving suit was dragged from the water in Chichester Harbour. The suit was covered in marine growth, indicating that it had been in the water for some time. The three fishermen who had made this grisly discovery took the body to nearby Pilsea Island and reported it to the Royal Air Force Station at Thorney Island. The body was then inspected by the police and removed to the Chichester mortuary. A coroner's inquest followed. Was the body that of the missing Commander Crabb? Curiously, at no time during the inquest did the Navy produce Crabb's medical records. Surely, a vital aid in helping to identify the remains of the frogman. The coroner determined that the body in the rubber suit was that of Commander Crabb. The cause of his death was unknown. The death certificate stated that the cause of death was not ascertainable. The body of the unknown man was buried at Milton Cemetery in Portsmouth on the 5th of July. Crabb's mother, Beatrice, was there, but she did not believe that the body in the coffin was that of her son. The headstone placed on the grave gave no dates and no Christian name. Commander Crabb's career as a diver had begun in the Mediterranean theatre in the Second World War. The Royal Navy's big guns were too much for the Italian battleships. But the Italians proved masters of another, more secret war. They had developed the so-called human torpedo, designed to carry a detachable 500-pound explosive charge and controlled by a two-man crew sitting astride the casing in specially designed diving suits. The Italians nicknamed this novel weapon the Matali, or pig. The crew's equipment was way in advance of anything developed by the British. And the clumsy early pigs soon became more sophisticated. On the 19th of December 1941, 3 human torpedoes of the Italian 10th Light Flotilla penetrated the British naval base at Alexandria. Their detachable, time-fused charges disabled 2 British battleships, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, so severely that they were out of action for several months. It was a triumph for the Italian Navy in a sea of defeats. Another Italian target was Gibraltar, where Crabb was the harbour's principal mine and bomb disposal officer. Crabb decided to fight the 10th Light Flotilla at their own game. It was the Italians' job to attach charges to the hulls of British ships. It was the job of Crabb and his underwater working party to remove them. It was a task requiring courage and the strongest of nerves. Crabb could hardly swim, but in the process he became an expert diver and authority on Italian methods. The British had a lot of catching up to do, developing submarine escape equipment into proper underwater breathing apparatus, and later training divers to operate their own human torpedoes, which were known as chariots. By the end of the war, combat frogmen were playing a vital role in Allied amphibious operations in the Far East and Europe. By 1945, Crabb was the principal diving officer in northern Italy, responsible for reopening the port of Venice to Allied shipping. Short, beaky-nosed and impatient with authority, he had become a legend in a very specialized form of warfare. After swimming in operations against Jewish terrorists in Palestine, Crabb was demobilized and found himself back on Civvy Street. But he was still a reserve officer in the Navy and continued to work for the Admiralty on the secret development of underwater filming techniques and mine warfare. He also spent time with the Royal Marines Special Boat Squadron, devising techniques for covert operations. Crabb was part of a secret world far removed from his well-publicized wartime feats. But he still popped up in the public eye. In 1950, he was involved in a major rescue attempt to discover whether there were signs of life from the men trapped aboard the submarine Truculent. She had been sunk in the Thames estuary after colliding with a tanker. Accompanied by another diver, Johnny Hodges, Crabb descended into the murky water to tap his way unavailingly along the submarine's hull. There was more secret work in 1953, when Crabb undertook diving operations in the Suez Canal, which remain classified to this day. In the autumn of 1955, Crabb joined forces with an old wartime diving colleague, Sidney Knowles, to investigate another Russian cruiser, Orjonikidze's sister ship, the Sverdlov. British naval intelligence was keen to discover the secret of the Sverdlov's maneuverability. Crabb and Knowles found that this was achieved by a propeller lowered into the water from a hole in the bow. To maintain British deniability, the operation was set up by the US Central Intelligence Agency. In March 1955, Crabb is thought to have received a letter discharging him from the Navy. But the Navy list for that year, and 1956, contain his name, linked with the Special Branch and the Navy's diving establishment at Portsmouth, HMS Vernon. It seems unlikely that British intelligence had let Commander Crabb go. And he was regularly seen at HMS Vernon, near the naval dockyard. After a short, unhappy marriage, Crabb had got a job as a furniture salesman in London, working for a friend, Maitland Pendock, who had an office in Seymour Place. He rented a small service flat next door to Harrods department store, hanging the Italian-designed frogman suit he favoured in the closet. Crabb frequently disappeared from his flat for days at a time on mysterious business trips. He enjoyed visiting the nearby Roman Catholic Church, Brompton Oratory. And in the local pubs, he was often to be heard complaining bitterly about his treatment at the hands of the Royal Navy. Maitland Pendock was a man with murky intelligence connections. He introduced Crabb to some interesting friends. Kim Philby, a Soviet agent in British intelligence. Philby was suspected of being the third man who, in 1951, had helped the Foreign Office moles, Burgess and Maclean, to flee to Russia. And Anthony Blunt, the keeper of the Queen's pictures, who in 1979 was publicly unmasked as the fourth man in the Burgess, Maclean and Philby affair. British intelligence had wrung a confession from Blunt in 1964 in return for immunity from prosecution. Both British and Soviet intelligence were keeping a close eye on Commander Crabb. But British intelligence had been thoroughly penetrated by the Soviets. Some alleged that Sir Roger Hollis, who later became Director General of MI5, was a Russian agent. According to Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer who defected to the British in 1960, his masters knew all about Crabb's mission against the Sverdlov and the plans hatched by British intelligence to use the frogmen to investigate the Orjonikidze. The Russians, claimed Golitsyn, were ready and waiting for Commander Crabb. He would have been of great use to them. The Soviet Union was then forming the nucleus of what was to become its Spetsnaz special forces. One component was a number of frogman battalions. In later years, the Spetsnaz was to become a formidable fighting machine, part of the GRU, then the main military intelligence gathering organization in the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, there were 4 Spetsnaz naval brigades with a strength of over 5,000 men. But in 1956, the technology available to its Frogman battalions was extremely crude compared to that used in the West. For its part, British naval intelligence had an inkling of the new Soviet swimming units. They wanted to know more. Could they infiltrate someone into the Soviet Union who was a diving expert? He might join the Red Navy and then be brought back to the West, armed with intimate knowledge of the Spetsnaz setup. Who better than the supposedly bitter Commander Crabb? One thing is certain. When Crabb and a CIA handler called Smith checked into Portsmouth's Sally Port Hotel on Tuesday, the 17th of April, 1956, the day before the arrival of B and K, they were on a secret mission. The hotel was full, and they took attic rooms. But what was the mission? Having examined Sverdlov the year before, there seems at first sight little reason to be snooping around her sister ship. Ironically, when 4 years later the Orjonikidze was sold to Indonesia, there was no trace of secret steering devices in her bows. It has been suggested that Crabb was investigating an anti-sonar device designed to reduce the cruiser's underwater signature, but this was a task more suited to a submarine than a lone diver. There is evidence that a year earlier, the British had used a midget submarine to investigate Orjonikidze when she was anchored in a Soviet harbour. But the X-craft had failed to get through the harbour's anti-submarine nets, so the British were clearly interested in the Soviet cruiser. The events of the 18th of April 1956 took place within a relatively small area. The Soviet cruiser was moored at the South Railway jetty, less than a mile from Crabb's hotel. Early that morning, and without being seen by anyone at the hotel, Crabb left. Curiously, the next day the pages in the hotel register recording his visit disappeared. He proceeded through the old town to the diving establishment at HMS Vernon. Here he collected and checked his equipment and, in all probability, received a briefing. With the tight security surrounding the Russian visit, he could not have done this without some kind of clearance. Then it was on through the entrance to the dockyard, where Crabb and Smith would have had to have presented passes at the guardroom. In the days leading up to the operation, Crabb had hinted to friends that he would soon be examining the Russians' bottoms. Now the time had come. There are 2 main candidates for the point at which Crabb and a small team of backup divers may have entered the water. The first is the King's Stairs, a stone's throw from the cruiser, but hidden from her lookouts, and at that time often used by divers. The second possible entry point was in the mast pond, where in the days of sail, masts were soaked and straightened. Orjonikidze was lying close to the elegant semaphore tower atop the naval buildings, which would have screened the nearby mast pond from her lookouts. The mast pond is now used as a pound for small boats, but there is access to the harbour by way of a tunnel, which runs under the road and buildings above. Excellent cover for Crabb and his backup team. Once in the harbour, the backup team could have left Crabb to feel his way towards the cruiser along the walls of the jetty. So far, so good. But Crabb's approach was anything but covert. He had launched his mission in broad daylight and was spotted by watch officers aboard the Orjonikidze. He was swimming on the surface with his face and flippers clearly visible. It was as if he wanted to be caught. And according to some, caught he was. Sailors who served aboard the cruiser have testified that Crabb was captured by 2 of its divers, and, after a struggle, transferred to the warship through a wet compartment. On the return journey to Russia, Crabb was helicoptered off the cruiser in the North Sea. A Danish trawler spotted someone, or something, being lifted from the decks of Orjonikidze as she steamed home. Back in the Soviet Union, it has been claimed that Crabb was brainwashed and then given a new identity as a Red Navy officer, Lev Lvov Koroblov, and set to work training Spetsnaz divers. But what of the body of the headless frogman found near Chichester Harbour? Here the mystery deepens, because it was in fact the second such body to turn up after Crabb's disappearance. The first had been retrieved by a fisherman, Harry Cole, in November 1956. When he hauled the body aboard, the head fell off and sank. Cole gave the body back to the sea, but not before removing some of the diving gear. He did not report the incident to the police until the following February. They showed little interest. Even when the second headless corpse turned up, Cole was not asked to attend a coroner's inquiry. Were the bodies one and the same? Or, as seems possible, were they two different bodies? The first a plant by a Russian submarine to cover Soviet tracks, the second dropped by the British for the same purpose. For the Soviets, it would have been a hit-and-miss affair to try to get a body back into Portsmouth Harbour. The swirling tides of the Solent could have taken a corpse dropped offshore almost anywhere. British intelligence would have had an easier task, both dropping a body and removing the pages from the hotel register. When it came to identifying the second body, security men made it clear to Sidney Knowles that, although it was not that of Crabb, he must identify it as his old comrade. The Italian-style suit seemed right, but Knowles noted that the body bore none of the scars he knew Crabb had picked up on wartime service. But if the body was not that of Crabb, where was he? Was he leading a new life in the Soviet Union? A photograph was produced purporting to show Crabb in Russian uniform. There was a resemblance, but it was clearly a man younger than Crabb. Hope was kept alive. Russian emigre organizations produced dossiers on the Spetsnaz diving instructor, Koroblov Crabb. There were reports that Crabb was about to be exchanged for a Soviet spy, but the Russians never produced him. He would have quickly outlived his usefulness to the Red Navy. They could hardly have returned him to the West, armed as he was with an intimate knowledge of the Soviet special forces. Crabb would have been trapped. In the 1970s, a flurry of reports hinted that Crabb was about to emerge from the Soviet Union to live in Italy. Close on their heels came others that he was gravely ill. Some researchers travelled to Prague to track Crabb down. They claimed to have traced him to a Czech sanatorium, where an Englishman closely answering his description died in the early 1980s. Did Commander Crabb die in the grey waters of Portsmouth Harbour? Or was he spirited away to the Soviet Union? As far as the British government is concerned, a veil of secrecy still shrouds Crabb's last dive, and the file on him remains closed until the year 2047. Was the dive in which Crabb disappeared a straightforward British intelligence gathering operation which went horribly wrong? Crabb was middle-aged and undermined by drink. Perhaps it was a dive too far. Or were the Russians, well informed by their moles inside British intelligence, waiting for Crabb from the moment he checked into the Sallyport Hotel with his CIA minder, the mysterious Mr. Smith? Or was he an infiltrator, planted by British intelligence with the express intention that he would be caught? Either a witting or unwitting pawn in a Cold War game. Had Crabb either volunteered or been cajoled into performing a last service for his country? Early in 1982, not long after Crabb is supposed to have died in Czechoslovakia, the headstone in Milton Cemetery underwent an intriguing change. We can be sure that Crabb is now at rest, but where remains a mystery. Near the Sally Port Hotel, a plaque commemorates generations of British naval heroes. There seems little doubt that Commander Crabb was one of them.